Okay, so welcome everybody to this seminar, which David and I have prepared and which we have called When History and Archaeology Meet the Future. And we're just going to give a brief introduction on how this came into being and what the background is. And then we follow the program, which basically stands as it was first circulated. And I shared again in the chat, so you can open that on your screen and follow it. Okay, so let's say a few words on the background. So the first time David and I were in touch is a few years ago, when in the context of the publication of this book, which actually I've got here, which is, as you can see, on historical understanding, past, present, and future. And that is an unusual addition in those sort of books. And the editors are Sultan Simon and Lars Staley. And they chose to ask both David and myself to contribute with short chapters to this. And so we learned about each other's work and had a little bit of email contact at that time. And then we met again last summer. There was a conference in Trento in early June in Italy. And David was presenting on directing history towards the future. And that was a remote presentation. And I was presenting on towards an archaeology of the future. And my colleagues were both contributing here, Anders Högberg and Gustav Wollens. They were also in Trento, and we also had a workshop together where we talked about similar issues like what will come up today, the relationship between historical disciplines, cultural heritage, and the future. And this was an interesting context because, as you can see, that the title of the conference was this: the discovery of the future in the social and human sciences. Now, if it's really a discovery, I don't know, but it's certainly something that is on the agenda in a new way, and that has been stimulating some discussion in various places. And that's the discussion we want to contribute and add to today through this seminar. And after this meeting, basically, David and I were in touch again and thought that it might be a great thing to do a seminar like this, where we invite a few people and make it open to whoever's interested to discuss these issues and add even more thoughts maybe to the discussion that had already started. Now, what we're going to be doing now, that I will say a few words on how I got into future issues, and then maybe David will say a few words on how he got into that. And afterwards, David will start with his lecture, and then followed after that, I will do my bit, and then we have the first break. So this is the plan. So let me just say a few words on my path into these future issues. Now, I should say that at the moment and for the past 7 years, I've been working in the context of this UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures. And I should say that both Gustav and Anders are also working in the context of that chair. So this is a big framework. And I don't know if you know about UNESCO chairs, but this is basically something that UNESCO gives us the label and we do the work. So it's for that. But I'm not going to go into all the details of what the chair is doing, and just want to point you to the chair's homepage, which maybe, Helena, you can put the link into the chat at the moment, so everybody can just click on it. But basically, there you can learn more on who we are and what we do. And we've just published our most recent annual report, where you get sort of the full view of all the various different activities. And one of the, just one final thing, one thing that I just want to highlight here a little bit extra is this book, which Anders and I have been co-editing a few years ago. in 2021. It was published with Routledge, and the title is Cultural Heritage in the Future. So this is one of the first book-length discussions of how cultural heritage and the future are connected, and a number of different aspects of what that could mean and how one could work with those issues. So when Sultan Simon, one of the co-editors of this book I showed you earlier, when he asked last year, does the past still matter? And he meant that as a serious question, given so many changes that we experience in the present. I guess the perspective of me and my colleagues here in Sweden is, does heritage still matter? And what does that even mean in the future? So these are some of the issues that we are concerned with and we are discussing in many different ways. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say initially. David, if you want to say a few words, maybe either generally or specifically on how you got into that.
How about I do, I guess, a little of both. Cornelius talked about the conference we both attended this summer that was put together by our colleague Roberto Polai at University of Trento. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he has sort of been the leader in what's being called anticipation or anticipation sciences. But it's all of a piece, I think, where the study of the future is now, well, when I say now, I mean within the last decade or so, been the source of serious scholarly attention. Futures work or interest in the future long pre. I mean, there's an interesting history to it. One could argue that in its most modern form, it dates to after the Second World War, and it's largely been found in think tanks, I think, and in and consultancies. It's been a practitioner-driven discipline, and at least in this country, I think the situation in Europe is quite different. In this country, at least, there are hardly any programs in future studies. It's difficult to get a degree in future studies. If you're asking how I got into this, when I arrived at university some 40 years ago, I was very interested in the study of the future, but there was no futures study. And in fact, in this country, there are only two places where you can get a degree. Now we might add three, and we might add Arizona State to this. But I think that what's been happening over the last decade and a half is a more serious focus, scholarly focus on the study of the future. I might say a little bit in my remarks, Cornelius, about how an historian ended up in this, because I think that history has been one of those disciplines that has studiously kept its distance from the study of the future, not by neglect, I think very deliberately stayed away from that. So in some ways, I'm one of the few historians who has an interest in the future. Future studies, I think, has attracted people from, because it's interdisciplinary, it attracts people from other disciplines. I think Roberto's political science. I think sociologists have an interest. Historians, not so much, and that's and there are various reasons for that. As I say, I'll address here in just a moment. All of that is by way of saying that, and I think the UNESCO chairs are proof of this. There is much more interest in the serious study of the future. So delighted that you were able to put this together. Delighted that Noah Sobey is here, who is also, well, he's not a UNESCO chair, or you're not a UNESCO chair, right? You are, but you're working at UNESCO.
That's right.
And I will introduce Noah more formally here in just a moment, but I also wanted to be able to connect Noah to the UNESCO effort here. So when Cornelius suggested this symposium, I was ready to jump on, because I really think that this is leading edge research.
Yeah, thanks very much. Obviously, I agree, and there are not that many archaeologists who are interested in working on the future either. I think most of the people who are engaged in future issues are actually part of this session right now.
Maybe so, yes.
Yeah, and good to see Chris here also now. So we'll come back to you later on. Okay, so then let's start with our two introductory lectures, and David will start, and I'll keep an eye on the watch, and then we swap roles in a moment. David, why don't you just start? Off you go.
Thank you, I shall. And so I have expanded the title, I suppose, in comparison to what was listed in the program, just to maybe give you a sense of where this is going to go, or where I picture this going. Context, complexity, sensitivity to initial conditions. That to me is history's contribution to the study of the future. And I say that because we are at a moment right now, and I suppose there. So shameless plug. Here's some of my work in history in the future. I suppose I should have. I suppose I should have put that first. But what I was going to say is we are at a moment right now where it seems that history, rather than historians, but history is being asked to say more about the future, and this is being couched in the sense that it's time for history to become a predictive science. And in various ways, all of these works are making that sort of claim, that we can study the past to see patterns that we can use then to project forward, and that it's time for history to be predictive science. By the way, this is hardly the first call. These authors are hardly the first to have made these sorts of claims. Peter Turchin, his most recent book, although he has made this argument in other works that he's written, his most recent book is called End Times. He says historians and philosophers vehemently insist, and I'm going to say this in the present tense, vehemently insist that a science of history is impossible. Our societies are too complex, humans are too mercurial, scientific progress cannot be predicted, and culture is too variable in time and space. Kosovo is completely different from Vietnam, and antebellum America can't tell us anything about America in the 2020s. This has been and still largely is the majority view. And he is absolutely right about that. He's absolutely right in that sort of characterization. He says, I want to convince you otherwise that historians are wrong, and that a science of history is not only possible, but useful. And I don't agree with him on this. For reasons that I want to elucidate here. But Turchin is of a type who look to history, and only sort of secondarily to historians, to give us the patterns, to help us identify what are the recurring themes, the recurring patterns that we can use to project forward. He's absolutely right in this characterization. This is how historians tend to approach the future. And this is because about a century ago, there was a debate, a philosophical debate between idealists and positivists. Positivists who were making the kind of claim that Turchin was, that history can be predictive. The idealists, and I'm vastly oversimplifying here, the idealists won out. And in a sense, what Turchin has done here is identified the idealist position, that as historians, what we study are specific, context-dependent, unique situations that have no sort of bearing, no sort of statement about what's to come, because they are, by definition, context-dependent and unique situations. We cannot make predictions about the future. Turchin, it must be said, is a population ecologist. He wants to apply theories of population ecology to human affairs. The people who tend to call for history as a predictive science tend not to be historians. They tend to be people that come from other disciplines and really see history as data, as a kind of a pool of data that they can apply their theories to. And in that sense, my argument, well, it's an argument that I draw from Michael Stanford, who draws a distinction between what he calls history sub 1 and history sub 2. History, because in English at least, and I think in some other languages, the word for history and the word for the past is the same word. That's what history sub 1 means. History in that sense means everything that's happened prior to this moment right now. But historians also think of history in another sense, history as a method, as a discipline, as that approach that studies the past. And I think that it's history sub 2 that's often ignored by people like Turchin, who don't think that historians have a method, that we just essentially create or identify the facts, identify the data that can then be used by theoreticians, and that historians don't have a theory, and that's our problem ultimately. They don't understand, or at least they don't accept, the method that historians use to study the past. I'm going to make the argument here that it's history sub 2 that we can use to study the future. Turchin and others are very keen on historical analogies, and that quote I gave you, we talked about Kosovo, for instance. And so they're very keen on historical analogy. I define analogies as similarities in the midst of difference. What Turchin and others would like is for us to find moments in the past that are similar to what's happening today, or indeed to say, what are the patterns, what are the things that are occurring in the past that are going to happen in the future? But I am always very quick to say historical analogies are based on the idea of similarity in the midst of difference. And it's the differences that we tend to overlook, or that these folks tend to overlook. Is everyone able to see the slides? Okay, good. I just saw that coming up there in the chat. So, sorry about that. So I like using this as a kind of analogy. This is a visualization from the designer Martin Wattenberg. And what he does here is that he takes identical piece or sections or pieces of music and then connects those together in arcs. And so Bach, of course, looks very regular and orderly and repetitive. And I think that Turchin and others want history to look like this, because then we can find these patterns and just simply project those forward. When in fact, history looks more like Vivaldi. If we're going to talk about historical analogies, that there aren't recurring patterns. There might be patterns that look the same. I call these, again, analogies, but they certainly don't repeat in any sort of periodic way that we can then use these to project forward. I've been really struck by this observation from the sociologists, Runner and Syme, who say the statement that the best predictor of tomorrow is yesterday applies only to modules. That is to say, to simple phenomena. In general, the simpler the event, the better the prediction. And I think that's probably true. If we're talking about simple systems, then yes, I suppose those are pretty predictable. The problem is that history, human affairs, human actions are rarely simple, and therefore very difficult to predict. They go on to say history never repeats itself exactly, which is sort of what I've been saying about historical analogies. Even for simple episodes, an event A and an event B are never identical, but only similar. To describe this form of similarity, they use the word paronymic, a term that comes from linguistics, where two words differ in spelling by one or two letters, but also their meaning is different. And so they like to use the term paronymic episodes to describe episodes that are not completely identical, but only similar. And that history could be said to be made up of these kinds of episodes. But it's the differences that matter as much as the similarities. And historical analogies are useful for framing present moments, but these have to be employed judiciously. We have to choose the right analogy, the one that aligns most closely, because there's rarely, if ever, anything like one-to-one correspondence between an event in the past and an event in the present, let alone an event in the future. After the fall of Kabul in 2021, immediately it was, oh, this is Saigon, 1975, which I argued was maybe an incorrect or maybe not the right analogy to draw. Maybe we could look at Lebanon, 1983. But the point is that analogies are rarely in one-to-one correspondence. That's because we very rarely deal with simple systems as in history. We deal, in fact, I would argue that all human actions, all human behaviors are represented, or they exist as complex adaptive systems. Interaction, meaning the interactions between parts in the systems are such that their aggregate behavior cannot be predicted. The most famous example, of course, is the butterfly principle, that a butterfly flapping its wings somewhere over West Africa disturbs the atmosphere such that it creates the conditions for a hurricane over the Atlantic. What's oftentimes not said about the butterfly effect is that that same butterfly could flap its wings and do nothing more than disturb the air around it. Either could happen because of the nature of, especially, sensitivity to initial conditions. So these are features of complex adaptive systems. They're open, not closed. Complex behaviors emerge from the system. Systems have unique histories. And it's this last one especially. They are exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions, which means you change the initial starting conditions even by a little bit, and you have a very different outcome. And that's another way, I think, of describing similarity in the midst of difference. Without going too much into the mathematics, this is how mathematics describes sensitivity to initial conditions. You use that equation down there. And so we're going to add x in each one. And simply by changing the value of x by 1,000th, right? So red is 0.998, blue is 0.999. You can see how the systems diverge, even with that very, very, very small little difference in initial conditions. This is how physicists and mathematicians describe sensitivity to initial conditions. I would argue that this is what describes history. This is what describes human affairs, which means that prediction can't work. History is therefore best able to address the state of complex adaptive systems because context matters. And historians, whether we choose to think of it or not, historians are context experts. We do not just simply accumulate facts about the past. That's the assumption that's made. We have a method that's especially tied to the idea of context. I would like to make the claim here that history is the study of the past behavior of complex adaptive systems. And again, Noah and Chris can correct me on, can either back me up or reject this, but I'm not certain that historians think of their discipline in this sense. That this is what we are doing, though, as historians. We study the past behavior of complex adaptive systems. Just to take one simple example, a simple or complex example, the origins of the First World War, the origins of the Great War, was the war itself was a nonlinear emergent effect of a complex adaptive system. And this is a question that I oftentimes ask my students: was World War I inevitable? If you think that there are patterns and regularities to the flow of events, well then, yeah, World War I was inevitable. Or if you think that events are context dependent, then no, there was nothing inevitable about the First World War. That some other outcome could have happened, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. This is a brief summation of the historical method, and what I suggest is that we use this method not to look at the past, but to look at the future. That this is what historians do when we're looking at the past. And again, Turchin and others would deny this, or maybe not understand what it is we do, how we study the past. I'm suggesting that we use this method to point our temporal lens forward into the future. It's that last one especially, creating representations, proposals. The philosopher Frank Ankersmit has written that what historians write are proposals, representations, replacements for something that is absent. The past. The past doesn't exist. We write these proposals about the past. And what a proposal means is that it's a pretty good model, it's a pretty good representation of what happens until a better one comes along. And those representations are something that are debated among historians. But we are never we never fool ourselves as historians, believing that our representation is the thing that we're representing. We understand that it's a useful fiction that we use to understand the past. But as a proposal, it's something that can always be refashioned or reimagined. And again, we can use the same idea for thinking about the future, that what we're doing is rather than making predictions, we are making proposals about the future. I mentioned counterfactuals a moment ago, and I wanted to draw attention to these. Some historians have become interested in counterfactuals. And if counterfactuals are true, if they exist, if they are ontologically actual, then they throw the entire idea of prediction or history as a predictive science completely out the door. And in fact, I would argue that the existence of counterfactuals demonstrates the existence of complex adaptive systems. So a counterfactual is basically, for non-historians, it's the idea that history could have unfolded in a very different direction had something else occurred. If Hitler had died in the bunkers in the First World War, would there have been the rise of the Nazis? It's a typical sort of counterfactual question. If Kennedy had avoided the assassin's bullet, would have America ramped up its war in Indochina and Vietnam? Those are counterfactuals. And the idea is that the existence of counterfactuals suggests that there is not one linear path to the future, that the future could actually have evolved in lots of different ways. It's something students grasp. It's something that students understand. This is the actual chalkboard from a class I taught about a year and a half or so ago, where I asked students to say, what if the North and South in the American Civil War had agreed to an armistice? In other words, I don't think the South could have won, but the two sides could have said, you know what, we've already lost too many men. Let's just end the war and go our separate ways. And they imagined three different scenarios. There's a reunification at some stage down the line, a few decades later, the two countries reunite. They imagined a second Civil War scenario, and then a U.S. imperialism over the Confederacy. And we did this over a matter of about an hour and a half or so. Students have this ability to think about alternative possibilities. But again, if you think that scenarios are a real thing, then that throws open or throws into question the idea that we can make predictions about the future. And indeed, I think that most futurists tend not to think in predictions. This is the ironic thing. Futures work today, especially in the consulting world and the think tank world, tends to be driven by scenarios, which are different from predictions. Herman Kahn defined them as a detailed portrait of a plausible future world, not a prediction. And in fact, a scenario was supposed to be one of many. You were supposed to be able to posit 2 or 3 or 4 different possibilities. I think of scenarios as different descriptions of how a complex system could behave in the future. But scenarios are proposals, in a sense. That's not the language that Kahn uses. It's a language that I would use. A prediction assumes that the future already exists, and that we're just simply waiting for time to march forward until we encounter that prediction. Instead, the future looks more like this. Its possibilities. In fact, I sometimes describe the future as a kind of quantum state. It both is and isn't at the same time. And I think sometimes we need to sort of think of it in these terms. It exists as multiple states until it gets measured. That's a sort of a definition of a quantum state. This is the same class, the same blackboard, but about 3 weeks later, where I asked students to say, remember what we did with counterfactuals? Let's do the same now thinking forward. And so the center here says, this is called a futures wheel. I think you're all familiar with futures wheels. ChatGPT-4 writes as well as an advanced undergraduate. What's that mean? What are the implications? And they thought through all the different possibilities, the different scenarios that could emerge when ChatGPT essentially replaces the undergraduate student essay. Undergraduates have this ability. Peter Schwartz wrote the book, The Art of the Long View, 30-some years ago now. And I remember it was an eye-opener for me. In fact, it was the book that got me into futuring and foresight as a consulting practice. In this book, he introduces the idea of scenarios, scenario thinking, the scenario method. He says some people are immediately great at scenarios. Others need more practice. He says that engineers and accountants aren't very good with scenarios. He says the anthropologist is more attuned to uncertainty and multiple points of view and can more easily accept the practice of scenarios. The same is true for historians. And I read that sentence and I said, well, yes, of course. because scenarios are simply the historical method aimed forward. That became the basis of the book I wrote, History and Future, that you can use the scenario method to think, that you can use the historical method to think about the future. And in fact, scenarios are built along a very, very similar sort of way as historians write about the past. So again, it's not the past itself, it's not the data that history brings to the study of the future. It's our particular method, our particular way of approaching the past. My argument then, and again, I know my colleagues just simply won't buy this, is that history sub 2, is the study of the potential future behaviors of complex adaptive systems. And again, using our method, we have the ability to think about the future. Thank you for your time and attention. And I will note that was exactly 20 minutes.
It was. So, thanks very much. I'll
pure luck, I assure you.
I can't find it well to hear the react. I wanted to give you a clap, an electronic one.
Thank you.
No, this was wonderful, very, very clear and provocative, I think, in many ways. So I think what I'll do is I'll just start straight away with my view, and then, as I said, we have a little break and hear some more reactions or commentaries afterwards, and then we have a lot of time for a discussion, and there must be many questions and issues to raise. Now, I've also changed my title a little bit, so I added archaeology because we are all archaeologists in this discussion on our side, and surprisingly, historians and archaeologists share a lot of things, but they are not a lot in touch with each other, and because we have very different approaches to things, and so there's some things we can, I think, all immediately agree on. And for example, David, in what you said, archaeologists are also context experts, and if you ask an archaeologist what are we best at, then I think everybody would say, well, in understanding context. Because that is how culture works, and that is what we try to understand in the past. But there are also some things where we, for bizarre reasons, are very unlike historians. And one symptom of that is that I've never seen any discussion of counterfactuals in archaeology, even though there is no good reason really why we shouldn't be dealing with that. But it's not a thing. But on the other hand, we have something else that is really big in archaeology and also in our group, but that only very few historians get involved in, and that's the what I want to talk about to some extent today, and that is heritage. Cultural heritage for us is directly linked to what archaeology is doing, and among historians that's sort of one step further away, I think, and there are some who deal with that, but many do not. Right, so that's why I have here archaeology, heritage, and the future. And now when I saw and heard David talk before and saw this with history 1 and 2, I thought, well, we can take this a bit further maybe. So I'm going to go, my talk consists of talking you through archaeology 1 to 8. And that adds a fair bit on heritage and a fair bit on the future, and I hope it'll all make sense as much as David's talk did. So let me go through that, and I won't spend as much time on the first two because basically these are different versions of what you already heard. It's similar to history 1 and 2. So archaeology 1, that's the past, except that in archaeology we often think about the really long-term past, so that goes back a few million years up to the first humans, but otherwise it's similar. And of course, something that David didn't say, but I think he also meant, is that that the past also includes past futures. People had always ideas on the future, and that has been studied. There are historians who have written a history of the future, and there's no full-length book in archaeology on this, but there are papers, including our papers, that make references to past futures and what you may be able to say about them. Right. Well, then there's archaeology 2, and that's a bit like history 2. That's the way we understand the past, the way we make sense of it. Our methodology of studying past human behavior. Now, in the case of archaeology, that's not just complex societies. It's a lot of all sorts of societies that have been part of human history, basically. And that is our technique of making sense of the past and telling stories about the past. And I should say, one thing that that both historians and archaeologists tend to be good at is in analyzing the data and structuring it. And they've always been presenting different periodizations of the past. So, I mean, like antiquity, Middle Ages, modern time, and so on. And archaeologists have also worked with Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on. So one of the paper I wrote in this volume, David and I contributed to, that was about, and I've never had any response to that actually, because again, I think people don't really understand the point of it. But I thought that, you know, it's up to us historians and archaeologists who should be quite in a good position to present a periodization of the future, exactly for the reasons that David was outlining, really. And I'm surprised that there are very few attempts at doing that. There are some by Marxists, for example, but there could be a lot. So that's archaeology 2. Right, and now comes heritage. So archaeology 3, that's something we haven't heard before, but I guess you may as well call it history 3. That's about the uses of the past in the present. That's what the past is how the past is put to use today. And that's what we call cultural heritage, or uses of the past, as it's sometimes known among historians. Now, examples, Putin, you know, we know him for many things. The leader of Russia goes into Ukraine and so on, but he also writes historical essays. And he did publish on the Kremlin's homepage, what is it, about an 8 or 10-page essay on why Ukrainian is really Russian. And you can have different views on this argument, but it is an historical argument. And that's significant. So this is an example of how he uses the past to legitimize Russian politics. Another example, since we've been mentioning UNESCO, is the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, where there are World Heritage properties that are meant to do certain things today. And then 10 days ago, I was in Saudi Arabia, and they have their own vision for 2030, and it's about finding a different economy beyond the oil in Saudi Arabia. It's true for the whole Gulf region. And so they are investing massively in archaeological research at the moment in order to create heritage sites that will attract many tourists in this future, maybe a decade or so away. So this is another way of how they use the past to change their economy. Okay, over to archaeology 4. Now, all these events of how the past is used, that's all well known, and there are lots of empirical studies about that. Now, but it's not self-evident. How are we to interpret that? How are we to make sense of all the heritage? And there are different views on this. And so I've mentioned here this new field of study that came into being, it's now maybe 20 years ago or a little bit less, which is known as critical heritage studies. And that has really mobilized what previously was known as cultural heritage studies. Now, what's the new thing? Traditionally, archaeologists and historians, I guess, they would judge uses of the past in respect to whether it's accurate or not, whether there's any research that would back people up in making this claim or that claim, whether Putin is right or wrong on historical grounds. And there's still going on a lot of discussion on this. But critical heritage studies, they take a different approach. So they're saying it's not about what is accurate or not accurate, but it's about what consequences does something have? How does it affect people's interests? Who benefits from that? So whether Putin is right or wrong is not interesting, but interesting is that this is used to justify a war and people die for it. And there we have an issue. And other concerns are for minorities or for all sorts of groups in society that may not benefit from particular forms of heritage. Local populations may not make money out of tourism, for example, is also a problem. World heritage sites may not benefit local communications, that's well understood. And there is an ethical dimension to that. So people have rights, and not just to be respected as such, but also a right to their own culture, a right, if they are indigenous people, a right to exist in the particular way of life that they choose for themselves. So all of these are different views on how we assess cultural heritage today, and what our sort of political view is on that. But within not party politics, but based on academic grounds and critical heritage studies. Okay, so all of this, so this was the first two archaeologies that align with David's. And then I added two more that are part of cultural heritage and how we study cultural heritage. So, and now we enter the realm of what we call heritage futures, because none of that was really about the future so far. It has implications for the future, but it's not directly about the future. Right, so what is heritage futures? Here's our definition. Heritage futures is about the roles of heritage in managing the relations between present and future societies. It's not about predicting anything. It's not about preserving the heritage for as long as possible. It's about managing relations. It's about how does what we do today affect what people will do in the future. Right, and our vision statement is the second bit here. So what we try to do is to build global capacity for futures thinking among heritage professionals. So we do a lot of futures workshops, for example, with UNESCO people and with people who have World Heritage sites or manage them, and with museums in Sweden and so on. So it's all about introducing them to what we call, and I'll come back to that, futures literacy. How to think about the future to improve your work, basically, to have a better outcome of what you're doing today. Right, so this is Heritage Futures. Let's enter into that. And that brings us to Archaeology 5. Now, Archaeology 5 is how will future archaeologists make sense of our legacy? This is something we find a lot in art, but also in the media. So lots of people, maybe you too, have been thinking about, how will future archaeologists make sense of what I've just been doing in my garden? Or when I throw away something, will archaeologists ever sort of be able to interpret that? It's often a rhetorical gesture. It's an idea. It creates some smiles, and it's almost like a joke. And I want to show you as an example. This is the classic example. The American children author David Macaulay. He wrote a number of fantastic books, and they were big in my childhood. This is from 1979, and it's called The Motel of the Mysteries. So that's when an archaeologist discovers an American motel and comes to all sorts of conclusions about that. So it's exactly that question. What will future generations, in this case, future archaeologists, what will they make of what we leave behind? What is the motel to them? Okay, so this is the question. What will happen? Let's move on to Archaeology 6. So this is about how do we come into that? How do we make sense of how future generations will make sense of our legacy? How do we judge that? How do we relate to these interpretations that people may or may not have in the future? Now, a lot of the way we make sense of that is actually pre-discursive, I should say. It comes from the stomach. It's intuitive. It's not rational. And that's what we try to change. That's what futures thinking changes, that we think more carefully on how we to consider these ideas that people may have in the future. Now, I'll show you two examples. One is about our desire in heritage, but I guess also in academia, to become good ancestors. And then I'll talk a little bit on nuclear semiotics, which is the case study all three of us have actually worked on over the years. Right, so good ancestors. This is the desire that people have today in the heritage sector, that we want to do the responsible thing. We want that in the future, however people will live there, that they will look back at our time and say, well, they did the best they could. They didn't try to do sort of cheap decisions, just thought of themselves. No, they accepted the responsibility they have for future generations, and they sort of invested in the future in that sense. Here's an example. The US National Historic Preservation Act filled 50 years, well, it's almost 10 years ago in 2016. And this is the sort of poster campaign, one of the posters from that campaign that went with that. And you see that this is, it's a happy scene of an archaeologist working for the future. And the slogan is "Our legacy, our future." So this is not based on anything. It's just sort of smiles all around. And it's seen as self-evident that what archaeologists have done over those 50 years will be appreciated by future generations as something valuable for the country at that time. They contribute to maintaining a history, in this case for the US, in the future. It's not based on any theoretical work, on any understanding of the future, on any. There isn't even any. There has never been a conference or meeting on this topic on what do we know about the future, or can we make a contribution in the best way. This is all intuitive. So that's one example. And here's the other example. That's the field of nuclear semiotics, which we've worked on for quite a bit. So this is the idea then that what we do today, for example, that we create markers about nuclear waste repositories, that they will be understood in the future in the way we meant them, and have positive effects in the sense that people will not dig holes precisely where the nuclear waste is being kept. So they will not be subjecting themselves to radiation in any ways that they and we would find regrettable and worth to prevent. So even that is not based on an understanding of the future. That's based on understanding of the present, on what dangers does radioactive material, nuclear waste actually have, and how can we sort of codify the information about these sites so that people hopefully and probably in this picture will be able to make sense of that. Right, so now comes archaeology 7. So we've only got 2 left, 7 and 8. Now 7 is what will actually happen. How will future generations make sense of our legacy, irrespective of what we may expect or assume about them? Now, this is not something we can have any knowledge of today. This is the realm of uncertainty. But that doesn't mean it's not significant to think about it. Maybe that's well, it's not even counterfactual. I don't know. It's prefactual. Maybe you could say that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with that, because it still means one thing, and that's the second aspect I wrote here. It still means that we shouldn't make assumptions on something that we cannot know. And so often, and I say this because practically everything we do about the future is based on assumptions. And David cited this insight that the best way to predict tomorrow is by looking at today or yesterday. But the longer, it's not just about complexity, it's also about time length. If we look at 100 years in the future, then it's not so good anymore to think about yesterday. And it's even worse if we think about 100 years in the past. So then sort of the one thing we can learn from this is that we shouldn't make assumptions on what is going to happen in 100 years or not. So there is an important lesson in that, not to assume things. And now comes the final bit, archaeology 8. And that is not just about the understanding that people will have in the future of their past, our legacy. But this is now, here comes the heritage idea back in. This is about how future generations will use the past in their present. And of course, we can't have certainty on that either. But what we can do in creating things today that will have an impact on the future, although we're not sure about what impact exactly this will have, is that we can give us more options. So I said earlier that an important thing to learn is that we shouldn't make assumptions about a distant future. But the flip side of this is then, what can we do? Well, we can give us at least a greater variety of choices, of proposals, to use David's language. We can give us more options. And together, this is the concept of futures literacy. So futures literacy doesn't mean, it's not about prediction. It's about accepting that there's a risk in making assumptions and that we can become better at understanding when we make assumptions, which is all the time. And at the same time, we can also get better at learning to imagine different futures, alternative futures, or alternative that can be based on scenarios or on proposals, whatever you wanna call it. And the function is that this gives us more options for today, and in that sense can make the chances higher that our work will not have immediate negative consequences. Although there are no guarantees. That is not there's no certainty about this. Right. So let me give you to at the end one example. Now these days I'm very much taken by artificial intelligence, AI. So I ask AI exactly these questions: how will future generations use the past in their present? And that was Chat GPT, and the answer is that image. So that's how Chat thought how future generations will use the past in their present. And Chat even gave gave a little bit of a text. This is Chat GPT writing. Here's an image showing how future generations might blend their advanced technology with a reverence for the past, seamlessly integrating historical knowledge and artifacts into everyday life through holographic displays. Right. Now, to me, this is not a very different future. This is the way the past is used today, basically. It's about preservation, it's about learning, education, and it's about accessibility. So you see people here looking, we can make it big again, looking at this big holographic device where they can learn about different periods. Of course, it's antiquity, but they also old cars, and there's the Statue of Liberty, and people sit there and study and learn. So I asked ChatGPT, well, look, can you make this a little bit more different than compared with the present? Because, this is not very different. So so what did Chat do? Well, this is the answer I got. It looked like that. That's the revised image. And to me, it's just the same again. It's even more high tech, but it's still about preservation. It's still about accessibility and people sitting at a table and they're studying and learning. So it's still the same, but even more technological, so to speak. So this is an example for how people are stuck in particular assumption on what heritage needs to be. And that is only sort of a very narrow paradigm of how heritage can be used in future generations. And that's exactly what I think needs to be changed, and where archaeology 1 to 8 or some numbers of those anyway can make a contribution to challenging that. And just to finish off, given the UN context of some of that, you will have noticed that and at the end of September, the Summit of the Future decided on a pact for the future. And that is a big agenda. For the first time, this has the UN a futures agenda. And it starts in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. They contain these sentences where it says that if we do not change course, we risk tipping into a future of persistent crisis and breakdown. Global transformation is a chance for renewal and progress grounded in our common humanity. Right. So now I'm asking, or we are asking, so what does that mean for the past, for heritage? What kind of past and heritage should we be working on today? So in order to perform this transformation that will rescue, create this sort of development, centuries. And just to finish up the I hope you can still hear me. I get the signal here. The internet is unstable. But this is my final quote. In the book that you saw earlier, Marek Tam from Finland, he also has a paper. And he asked that question, which is also my question. How to make sense of the past and heritage in a world where the future is not what it used to be? So that's the question. What options do we have? What possibilities are there? And what assumptions maybe we shouldn't make? And I'll leave you with that. So thanks very much. So should we just follow the plan, David, and have a short break?
I think it's always good to have a break. Adults always need to be able to get up and move around every hour or so, I think.
Exactly. Okay, so let's say 10 minutes. We're a little bit behind, but not dramatically. So we'll reconvene at in 10 minutes at well, it's 20 to 4 here and it's 20 to 10 in the US, assuming you're on the same time zone, which you may not be. Okay, see you soon.
Progress.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Say it again.
I just asked if you want to take the chair the next presentation, and then we can take turns as we agreed. So we chair each other's speakers, so to say.
Oh, then I will ask you to introduce Anders then, if Anders is next up.
I can just say very briefly that Anders and I, we are colleagues. He's also a professor of archaeology at Linnaeus University, and we are collaborating in the UNESCO Chair. But he's also doing a lot of other research, and maybe what of that is needed. Unless you can decide yourself if you want to mention any more.
I don't need to go into that, do I?
Okay.
So good. Thank you so much for these presentations. As I didn't really know what they were going to be about, I decided to improvise. So I have improvised some slides here to share. I guess we are here now, are we? Do you see me? See it? Good. So this is just to add to what you, David, and Cornelius talked about. I can start with an anecdote. Last week, I was on a big archaeological symposium in Uppsala here in Sweden, where the SciLife lab with talked about big data, advanced archaeometric analysis, and building, climate, deep time climate analysis. And they all ended up in saying that using this knowledge, we can predict the future. And I was like, what? Why do you want to predict the future? And no one can answer that, because to them, they are expert in using big data to analyze climate change in deep time over a long-term perspective, but they have never been into what we are talking about here today. So to them, it comes natural to predict the future. And as both David and Cornelius said, it's not about predicting the future. It's so much more complex than that. So that was just an anecdote. And now I just thought I could build on what you have both been talking about. If we look at the definition of heritage, the two top lines here is a very old definition, claiming that it's a legacy from the past that we can hand over from previous generations to those to come. And that is the conservation or preservation paradigm that Cornelius was talking about. Now, if we use a slightly more modern, so to say, definition, heritage is the tangible and intangible from the past that is activated to shape meaning and action in the present, and in doing so contribute to building specific futures. If we look at heritage in that way, the sort of heritage processes that are involved in that is activated to shape meaning and action in the present, they are actually futures making. So they contribute to build specific futures just by being activated in the present. And if we understand heritage in that way, it becomes really interesting to know more about how to understand the future, as we have been talking about. And this is a figure that we published in one of the books that, or the book that Cornelius mentioned. And that is abstract illustration that is quite similar to the one you presented, David, where you stand in the now in the middle, and then you look at the future, and you said there are a lot of scenarios, and these scenarios here are sort of specified into different futures. And the preferred future, that is the the future that people want to predict. That is, they want a specific thing to happen because they have a specific reason to make it happen, or that is just a normal way of understanding the future, planning for the future, or looking at the weather forecast, finding out how it will be tomorrow. But if you broaden up that perspective, you will be able to, in the present, visualize probable and preferred and plausible and possible futures. And that will inform the action, as Cornelius talked about as futures literacy, inform the actions here that we can do today. And what we were trying to say with this figure as well is that the past is the same. So you can, if you have a preferred future, you normally use a preferred past to visualize the preferred future. That is, you use the past in a specific way because you want something to happen in the future. But then there are a lot of other plausible and possible pasts that some of them are in the range of what we understand today. And some are not, because we have not been able to ask the right questions or apply the right methods yet to understand the multiplicity of the past. So if we look at the relation between the past and the present and the future in this sense, or in similar sense, we understand that it's a multidirectional intellectual task we have now when we stand here in the now, both understanding the multiplicity of the future, but also of the past. And if we do that, it might open up for us to understand the present in a different way. So predicting the future, it is just trying to make the things we know now be knowledgeable or having an impact in the present. And if you understand the future and the past in a different way, you are also, may be able to question the current status quo. And this is what I think it's a quote normally said to be Einstein who has said it. I have no idea if that is true or not, and it doesn't matter. But I think it's still relevant. The problem cannot be solved with the same set of thoughts that once created it. I will give an example later on. Oh, sorry, wrong button. And then another question to ask is, what are the stories that may become important in the future that we do not fully understand how to address today? And that goes to what Cornelius talked about. But my point is here that we don't fully understand how to address them today. That meaning that if you open up for multiple possible futures, is also feedback to what you know. And then you can ask yourself, what do I need to know now to understand how to deal with the multiple futures? So what kind of new questions do I need to ask now to be able to understand actually how to address that in research, for example? And that is partly to avoid dealing with used futures. And that is a term in future studies, meaning that it's actually not futures. So it's visualized as futures, but it's actually just extending the present into the future and not providing alternative futures. So imagine alternative future. As history is a place for imagination, how do we best act to envisage futures that provides alternative to what we so far have been able to imagine? And that is a way to avoid colonizing the future with current thoughts. Of course, that is not something wrong, but if you claim that you want to change something, but still using the same thoughts for the future as you use today, you are actually not changing things. You're just colonizing the future with what you know today and not open up for alternatives. Along this line, we also need new past. Which new past do we need to invent to be able to understand futures in new ways? And that is about asking new questions in the sort of model that I showed earlier on. I will jump to an example. So this is a report that you see here to the left from a Swedish authority. It's in Swedish, but translated in a crude way by me. It says that armed conflicts risk destroying cultural heritage, as has happened in recent years, exemplifies with Syria and Ukraine. Oh, sorry. And then they say this underlies the importance of planning how a country's cultural heritage can be protected during conflict and war. And then our Swedish government have invested millions and millions in euros into having the whole heritage sector and museums in Sweden starting to work with this, to list heritage that needs to be protected and to take actions on how to protect it, to make policies and emergency plans, etc., etc. And that is, of course, necessary. You need to think about those things in a conflict. It doesn't need to be a war. It could be a climate disaster with flooding comes in, and you need to know how to handle that. But the point I want to make here is that you need to add complexity to this, because in the actions suggested to protect heritage, the future is very, very explicit in the form of an anticipated armed conflict. And that means that the future that they are sort of visualizing is radically different to the present. But the cultural role of heritage in that future remains unchanged. So what is happening is that they visualize a different future, but not a different use of heritage in that future. And if you do that, if you take the status quo today and put it into the future and saying, here you are, the future, this is how you should understand heritage because we think it's important now, then you miss out, for example, what Cornelius talked about. Do we really think that the future needed the heritage that we preserve for them today? Do we really think that they need it in exactly the same way as we preserve them? That is, we are narrowing down this whole range of multiple futures into a preferred future for cultural heritage that is relevant today without having no discussion whatsoever about will that be relevant in the future as well. And the discussion is very much on national identity, identity politics, and it is claimed that heritage has inherited values, as, for example, we need to preserve this specific heritage because it shows what it means to be Swedish. Along these veins, last year, the large Swedish Museum Association had its largest meeting, the annual meeting. One of the civil servants responsible for this role spoke about cultural heritage as a flesh and blood of a nation. Now, to me, that is talk that we have heard in Europe in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, and after the 1950s, it's not so common to talk about heritage in that way in official matter, but here we are. Now, as Cornelius said, futures literacy means to become awareness of one's assumptions about the future and to acquire the capability of imagining and working for alternative futures, that is, futures that differ from the present. So it would be reasonable to both make these policies and plans on how to protect the heritage and to talk about the future in an informed way. And suggestions could be to start from questions like this. How do we invent new ways to use heritage to avoid the devastating consequences exclusionary use of cultural heritage in crisis situations has for societies opportunities to create resilient and sustainable societies? For example, if we talk about heritage as the flesh of blood of a nation, will that create a sustainable and resilient society post-conflict? We have no idea, but We have a lot of evidence from Europe from the 20th century that it didn't create that. It actually created conflicts that we are still living with in Europe today. So how do we use heritage now to ensure resilience and peacekeeping in post-conflict times? How do we create abilities to renegotiate and develop society's view of culture heritage, to find new ways to relating to issues of belonging, identity, and memory, related to culture heritage to improve resilience and abilities to work against instability, threat, and destruction? If we want that future to happen, that is, if we don't want instability, threat, and destruction, how can we use heritage to work against that? How do we think beyond preservation of objects and places, as such focus may make society more susceptible to manipulation from hostile intelligence operations? And that is the last thing I have, because if we point to heritage and saying that this site or this thing or this heritage represents Swedish identity, it tells us who we are. What happens if we fail to preserve it? Will we build a more resilient society if that is a failure? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anders. I'm resisting the temptation to jump in and push a couple things, but we can do that during the discussion. I appreciated the futures cone. By the way, I've been exploring lately Joseph Voros's preposterous futures. There's another cone beyond the possible futures, preposterous futures. Maybe we can talk about those at some stage here. Thank you for that. So let me briefly give an introduction to our next commentator. So that's Noah Sobey, professor of history of education and futures of education at Loyola University in Chicago, although he informs me that in January, he'll be heading back to Paris to take up a position as chief of section for higher education at UNESCO. He previously authored the Futures of Education report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, when he was senior project officer for UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative. Noah, thank you, and congratulations on your new appointment.
Thanks very much, David. It's great to be with you and see some of you. Cornelius, I saw you in Trento. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm really thrilled to be part of it. I'm approaching this a bit more as a discussant. David, whenever I reach time, just tell me to stop and I'll stop. So I want to talk about, clearly, like some thinking about the relationship between the past and the future is informing our conversation. I want to talk about past futures. Cornelius mentioned this. I tend to use the term imagined tomorrows, but I think we're talking about the same thing. And then if there's time, I want to go into sort of counterfactuals and speculation. So, maybe a first thing is to, absolutely agree with David that, the historical profession is very uncomfortable with the future, right? And I think partly that's because people do tend to turn to us, to ask what's going to happen. And we're smart enough to know that the world is contingent, that conjuncture is serendipitous, that there are complex adaptive systems, as David talked about, that make prediction extremely difficult. I was, however, reminded of the famous, I think it's a Mark Twain line. I don't know, maybe, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it echoes. I find that useful. But so David mentioned, I was involved in a Ed Futures project in Paris. Author is not quite the right word. I did hold the pen, but these things are corporately authored. And so through that, I got to work quite a bit with a colleague of all of yours, Riel Miller. And I've sort of come to the position that, I mean, it's best to think of, or I guess it's that I see the future and the past as like remarkably similar in that like they are equally inaccessible to us. You know, um, we have traces from the past in our present, right? This building, this house that I'm in right now was built in 1907, right? As historians, we go into archives and reread these documents. And David talked, I think, entirely correctly about history as a process, as a practice, a project of representation, right? We're just simply trying to tell stories about the past based on what we can manage to accumulate in the present. And I think the same is true with the future, right? The future doesn't exist except in the way that we think about it in the present. Of course, there are things like, I hope, this house that I still have a huge mortgage on, will be around in 20 years. But we don't know, other than like our expectation that things will trace into the future, what will actually be in the future. So I think there's like a very comparable unknowability world of representation around the future and the past that really makes them quite similar. I mean, I sometimes talk about them as two halves of the same whole, that whole being like the accumulating possibilities that we as interdependent human beings, can imagine, can experience, can avoid, can create. And that takes me to, I have a comment on the futures cone and Anders's useful expansion of that, as a past cone and a future cone, which in one sense is very related to what I'm saying. But whenever I see the futures cone, and even it comes even more stark in this basically bow tie representation, I'm always troubled by how thin the present is taken to be, right? I mean, Anders is making some really useful points about, understanding multiple scenarios in the past and in the future. But that also like invites us to think about like the multiple scenarios in the present, right? And I think if you spend time, for example, I mean, there's a whole lot of literature that would examine that. But like think what first comes to mind is like the literature on indigenous futurity, right? Which is an attempt to like expand within the present the notions of what is possible, what has been possible, what might be possible. So I guess two halves of the same whole, maybe it's rounder, maybe it's diamond shaped, but I want to like move that bow tie in some direction. Second, to go to past futures, imagined tomorrows for a second. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Cornelius. In the historical scholarship, this is an area that has attracted increasing attention. I think of Michael Rawson's book on the nature of tomorrow, which is an environmental history of imagined Earth futures, or imagined planetary futures. It's fantastic. I also think of Roxanne Panchassi's book, Future Tense, The Culture of Anticipation in France Between the Wars. I think it's a 2009 book, and she's looking at the way future was anticipated in France in the 1920s and 1930s. And again, it's similar to the way that, a historian might study cultural memory, right? Or commemoration practices. Those become important in a given society because they shape the range of what's possible, how identities are embodied. And the same can be said of how we imagine the future, right? At any given point, that's, going to have significant consequence for individuals, for groups, for communities, etc. I'm always fascinated with the question of like what we think will change or what change is possible. And when I taught a course at Loyola here on the history of the future, and my colleagues were like, "What?" And my students were like, expecting something that was way more exciting than they actually got. But you know, when I sort of pitch this idea, you know, that imagined tomorrows, you know, really say a lot about a particular historical moment. I usually use the example of like the Jetsons versus like early 19th century literature, like something like Mary Shelley's Last Man or Maria Edgeworth. So like, okay, in the Jetsons, right? We're imagining a future world and, you know, technology has changed. People are using different vehicles flying around, but the domestic relationships have completely remained the same, right? The man is the breadwinner. You then go back to the early 19th century and people are writing these like someone falls asleep and wakes up 300 years later stories. Um, the technology is typically the same. People are riding horses and they're sailing in boats, but the social relationships, you have female-dominated societies. So it's a useful comparison, I think, for showing like sort of what we expect to be possible in the realm of change, you know, is hugely significant and contoured by, you know, our perceptions of the moment. Connected with that, although it's a bit of a tangent, I agree. We're not about prediction. However, I think we also need to be very attentive to manufactured uncertainty. Like, there's a whole line of work around agnotology. It's the study of ignorance, right? And, you know, people have examined, for example, like the uncertainty about the dangers of smoking that the tobacco industry cultivated. And the same is said, you know, about climate change. Um, you know, what the oil companies have said, well, we don't know, etc. You know, that kind of like strategic ignorance, I think needs to come into our conversations about, okay, we're not about prediction for sure, but there are things, some things in our present that we can reasonably expect into our future. For example, this house with an expensive mortgage on it, I hope. But also demographic changes. You know, they're going to be a little bit different, but I do believe that like the youth bulge in Africa is going to have some consequences that are pretty foreseeable, you know, over the next 30 years. All right. If I have one more second, I'll just say something quickly about counterfactuals and speculation. This is going to be unformed a little bit because I think I'm pulling with some of the stuff that Cornelius and Anders were working on too. That there's and I think David's saying this too. There's something very like creative, generative about going into sort of both future speculations and past speculations. And the kind of counterfactual history that I've been reading lately is a little bit less of like, okay, the bullet hit, the bullet missed, and then how does the world unfold? And a little bit more about like how could alternative worlds have unfolded? So the example of this that I'm most taken with is Laurent Binet's book, Civilizations, which reimagines the encounter between Europe and the New World, where there's an important element of Eric the Red's Viking daughter having come down the coast of North America and introduced a few domestic animals and some knowledge about iron. Anyway, it's a fun book, Laurent Binet, Civilization. And he basically has not Columbus discovering America, but Columbus coming to America, dying, and then the Aztecs learning to sail his ship and take it back to Europe. And then the Incas and the Aztecs have a wonderful battle in Paris. It's a beautiful piece of work. So anyway, I'll just close with that you know, this, I think the past and the future are equally useful resources for you know, mining speculative possibilities. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Noah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Noah. And since I have the word before I introduce Gustav, just one brief comment, because I completely agree with what you said that on this point of strategic ignorance. That's a great term. Well, when I said you look frozen now, actually, no, I don't know what's
Yeah,
going on.
I am.
But
I think I have to reboot. I might leave and come
okay,
back.
but you hear us and we hear you, so that's okay.
Okay.
So what I wanted to say is that when I said earlier that actually what future people will make of their past is uncertain, and how they will use the past, then I think that's still there's a valid point in that. But what I didn't say is that we can, but what I really believe is that we still can make choices on what alternative futures they may have more use for than others. And this is exactly the sort of thing you were talking about. And people refer to that as mega trends. At the top level, this is not about detailed events on who will say what in the year so and so. But this is about, like what you said, it's about climate change, environmental change, it's about demographic changes, where the people who will make the changes in 20 or 30 years, they're already born today. So we can say certain things about that. Also about movements of populations, globalization, urbanization, and so on, and also certain technological trends. Now with AI, I think that's a game changer for the next decades, and we know it. And we shouldn't pretend that we don't, although we don't know every detail of what will happen. So absolutely, I think that's a very important point in that. Right, but with that said, let's move on to our next speaker, and that's Gustav Wollens, and he's another colleague of mine here in Kalmar in southeast Sweden. And he's also affiliated with the UNESCO Chair and works in that context. But he's also, in terms of his teaching responsibilities, he's responsible for our heritage program. And I just want to mention the name of that program because that's quite significant in this context. It's called in English translation. It's about cultural heritage in present and future societies. But it's almost as good as the history of the future. Noah, that you were talking about for your students. So we have actually a whole program on heritage in present and future societies, and Gustav is the one who is running it. So with that said, Gustav, give us some thoughts on what you're making of this topic of heritage or archaeology and the future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cornelius, and also thank you, David, for both of you for like very inspiring lectures, thought-provoking in many ways. Also very good, comments by Anders and Noah. I don't know if maybe he disconnected now to fix his screen. Anyway, very good seminar so far. I'm very happy about all of it. Thanks also for highlighting the heritage program. I can notice that we have actually at least one student from the heritage program present today. So I'm happy to see you here. Per, thanks for joining. I'm going to share a screen now. Let's see here if it works. I guess you can see this screen now. My short commentary here will be focusing more on like practical examples on how we have been working with heritage futures among the heritage sector. But I would also say that a lot of the things that will be mentioned here also has relevance for the subject of history and also for the subject of archaeology. But it will be more broadly the work on heritage futures with the heritage sector here that I will be focusing on. And I think I also do think that Sarah May, I do think I saw her name here, so I think she is also joining here today. So Cornelius, Anders, me and Sarah May, we have conducted interviews with the heritage professionals in Europe and as well as on a more global, also outside of Europe, where we have been examining ways of understanding and working towards the future within the heritage sector, like with different on museums and county administrative boards and such organizations. So we have kind of received a larger understanding on it, even if more work would be needed. And the kind of inspiring thing about these conversations that we've been having is that we have been really noticing among heritage professionals that there is a great interest to engage more proactively with the future through kind of learning and acquiring new methods, skills, tools, and routines. Even though there is not a large, on an overall level, it's not a large knowledge on how to do it, on what kind of tools there are and what kind of skills are needed. It's not a lot, there's not necessarily a lot of knowledge all the time about it. And sometimes during the very conversations that we are having, the kind of realization pops up that, yes, why are we not actually engaging more proactively with the future? Sometimes it's actually during the conversation. But there is definitely an interest there that we have noticed. And there are also resources available. I'm showing some here on the slide here, the Futures Toolkit by the UK government, for example. However, they are seldom directed specifically towards people working with heritage. And I think that that makes it a little bit, that makes it a little bit more of a hindrance, I think, for people within the heritage sector to pick them up and start using them, since they are very useful, but they are not maybe always using the kind of vocabulary that people within the heritage sector are accustomed to and so on. So I think that there is a lot more to do there in order to actually produce resources that are more tailored towards the heritage sector. There are some, for example, this strategic foresight toolkit that the American Alliance of Museums have developed, but it's more specifically within an American context and for museums, so it's still quite limited. And at the UNESCO Chair, we are also working on producing resources for the heritage sector. And we are also, as Cornelius was mentioning, and I think Anders was mentioning as well, we are also doing regularly workshops on different scales with focusing on futures literacy among heritage professionals. Another example on a more global scale is the work that we have been doing with ICROM, which is the International Center for the Study of the Preservation, Restoration of Cultural Property, which is also an advisory body to UNESCO in terms of the World Heritage Convention. And there we have worked in various ways together with them, we have worked in various ways with strategic foresight, and with a method called horizon scanning, which is a method for tracking early signals of change. And actually foresight has been mentioned a few times, but just for like a brief description, just for those who are really who don't know what foresight is. It is a systematic and structured way of engaging more proactively with the future through a set of tools, skills, and ways of working. Foresight is not. It is not about predicting the future. We have been talking quite a lot about that, but that's not what foresight is. Sometimes it's being perceived as that, but that would be more like forecasting. But foresight is not about predicting the future, but it's rather about creating different options for the future. So it aligns very much with previous comments and presentations. And for example, in one of the exercises we did, we gathered an interdisciplinary team of 18 researchers and 2 advisors from different world regions, collecting over 60 research reports looking out over a 15-year horizon, based on the question, what emerging issues might affect heritage conservation, ICROM, in the future. I don't have any time to go into the results of this report here. And there's also a list of useful tools in this report for those who are interested. And it's available open access, anticipating futures for heritage. We can also notice that there are steps taken also on a kind of local level. there is an interest in future literacy, for example, among museums that we can notice that is starting to pick up. That we can notice in some cases that there's a step from simply being interested or wanting to learn more towards actually doing something in practice, moving towards working actively with futures literacy. And there are examples of that. One of them is the Naval Museum in Karlskrona, which is located fairly close to where we are having our campus in Kalmar. And they are at the moment developing. They are in the moment producing a new permanent exhibition, which is going to be focusing on threat and the concept of threat and how we cope with threat. And one of the main goals of this exhibition for the visitors is to actually increase futures literacy among those visiting this exhibition. They're in the process of developing it now, so I actually do not know the outcome of it, but we have been involved in as advisor in some ways. We have been giving our input and how you can actually work with futures literacy in different ways in this exhibition. We do not know how it's going to turn out, but it's one example of a museum that's actually starting to pick up the concept of futures literacy and doing something in practice with it, which we find, of course, exciting. And just one final slide here. I don't know if I actually do not know what my time is at the moment, but just one final slide here. So the previous examples that I mentioned here has more focus on how the heritage sector can, apply tools and work with futures literacy in different ways. But another aspect that I think has been mentioned by previous presentations by Anders and Cornelius and David in some ways, but it's that the fact that how the future is, how we perceive the future, how our ideas and perceptions of the future are also already present in informing contemporary heritage practices, as well as our understanding of history in different ways, for example, through hope, desire, fear, expectations, and so on. So this would be more of an anthropological or sociological understanding of the future, but with great relevance for both the subject of history and also for heritage studies, so that perceptions and ideas of the future are also in the present constantly informing how the past is understood and how heritage is constantly being made, which of course has implications for our work as well. And we have been using that as a basis for a small study in Växjö, in a neighborhood called Araby. Växjö is also located close to Kalmar, where we are examining how young people are investing as this neighborhood, this place, with hope for the future, and what kind of heritage, what kind of practices are involved in investing a place with hope for the future, and what kind of heritage is being created and recreated through the process of investing a place with hope for the future. So there's another kind of angle to it, which is also important, I think. So thank you very much. That's just a few examples of how we've been working with this. And you can also reach me on this email, of course.
That's magnificent, Gustav. Thank you. Simply magnificent. Well, unless Cornelius, you have anything to add or subtract, I'll be very happy to introduce Christopher McKnight Nichols.
All right. Very brief introduction. I'll take it, David.
No. I'm going to give you a longer one. I just wanted to make certain you were there.
Okay.
So my colleague at Ohio State, Christopher McKnight Nichols, professor of history and Wayne Woodrow Hayes Chair in National Security Studies at the Mershon Center here at Ohio State. Chris specializes in the history of the United States and its relationship to the rest of the world, particularly in the areas of isolationism, internationalism, and globalization, as well as the role of idea. This is the part of his research I really enjoy, the role of ideas and ideologies in U.S. foreign relations. Part of the reason I invited Chris to provide some comments is, I don't know if you think of yourself as a futurist necessarily, Chris, but he is frequently called upon by the media to provide commentary and analysis. In fact, just last week during our ill-fated elections, Chris was very much in the media providing context and meaning, I think. So, Chris, delighted you were able to join us today.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind comments. And it's a pleasure to join you all here. Wish I could be in Sweden with so many of you all. I have a couple historian friends. Fred Logeval is one with whom I'm constantly in touch. In any case, I wanted to say, as David noted, that apologies, some leaf blowers have descended on my block. If you hear an annoying buzzing, that is precisely what that is. I come to this from the study of grand strategy, in part, as David noted, and talking at the intersection of scholarship and public commentary and public history. In the study of grand strategy, in very brief, these schools of grand strategy have proliferated around the world with a sort of presumption that if you can understand Shakespeare and Kierkegaard and Henry Kissinger, you can be a better grand strategist in policy circles. One thing we haven't talked much about specifically here has been policy and future planning, policy planning. And I think in roughly the last decade, this proliferation has been going on. Really, it started in the US context after the Iraq War, starting these schools. But they've proliferated at Oxford and Cambridge and elsewhere. But in the last decade or so, long-term thinking has seemed quite absent from electoral cycles, from policymakers. So we've seen shorter and shorter time spans, I'd say, of how policymakers tend to think. Some states, however, have tried to push back. I don't probably need to tell you all a capsule history of that. Wales, I think, was the first to have a commissioner of the future. Canada, Hungary, Israel, a handful of other countries have attempted to put future planning in. Something else we haven't talked about is trying to talk through the distinctions between future generations' rights and responsibilities, and what are the relative rights and responsibilities as a sort of philosophical and political question between the present and the future, those future generations, unborn or barely born, as Cornelius was noting and Noah was suggesting, right? We have these assumptions about demography and about who those people will be, but in a kind of humanistic sense, what do we know? What do we owe them? Are kind of new questions for policy planners in particular, for citizens who are voting. And I also think, the major crises of the moment, this came up earlier, from COVID, we haven't talked much about the pandemic, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to all of climate change, which is really central to so much future thinking, future fiction, future policy planning. A lack of preparedness on behalf of citizens and policymakers is a central challenge of our current moment. So in my scholarship on the history of grand strategy, one of the things I've tried to do is look at the historical record and try to determine who else should count beyond these policymakers. So in the US context, or in the context of the schools that study, the most famous is Yale's grand strategy, they often limit this to the kind of traditional political science definition of hard power. The matching of necessarily limited means as a definition to long-term aspirational ends. So at its most widened traditional sense, that's about shaping the peace that comes after the war. But what about some of the many things we're talking about today that came up, starting with David's really sharp comments about how to think through analogies, similarities, and differences, scenarios, multiple kinds of scenarios, moving through the sort of proposals questions. I was struck by a number of things that Cornelius said, including those first questions about how does the past still matter? And I would say the how is crucial. How does it matter as a usable past? And to what extent is a version of the same question useful in terms of heritage? How does heritage matter? How do you leverage heritage to do the work we want in the present, to do the planning for possible future scenarios, to achieve the kinds of ends that at least the people in this conversation aspire to? That is, to be those ancestors who took up the obligations of the future and aren't at least castigated for failing. In the very least, that's a threshold hopefully we can cross. One of the things I think about then in the policy realm and in the way that David was setting us up in terms of history, historians are very shy about making predictions. But the use of history is omnipresent in politics, in virtually every nation state, in the politics of the long past through the present. You can find this in the historical record. But one of the things that I think about in recent years was Ash Carter, who's a scholar who ran the Belfer Center at Harvard, who was a Secretary of Defense, argued that the dominant mental methodology of real policymakers, in his experience, both as a scholar and a policymaker, was historical reasoning. And that it wasn't political science, it wasn't philosophy, it wasn't economics, and it wasn't archaeology. But that striking assertion is one that shouldn't surprise us. The problem, and this goes back to some iconic literature of historians and political scientists like Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, a book called Thinking in Time, which I highly recommend. And as a bullet point there, they talk about time as a stream, which I think is a very useful way to think about the sets of possibilities there. The cone is one way, but a stream is another way, or multiple streams that are coiled around each other. It may either challenge Noah's point about the present and complexity, or it might be one that we could embrace. But in any case, one of the ways that I come to this in my own scholarship and in doing political commentaries, that trying to draw out those useful analogies for audiences, while at the same time keeping in mind the complexities, right? And this is a real challenge for doing heritage work, as I understand it, because you need to communicate to these broader publics the simplicity of some of the messages, right? This is the futures toolkits, while at the same time grasping the complexity in the gray areas, right? That we as scholars, we as thinkers, we as intellectuals necessarily are primed to use our methods towards, right? That we embrace complexity, we embrace the gray areas, and therefore it's a challenge in communicating and doing the next steps for policymaking. So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize there, and I know we want to jump into our conversation, so I really don't want to go too long, but at the intersection of these burgeoning kind of ministries for the future, to use Kim Stanley Robinson's phrase from his book, one of the things that I see in that account, which is interesting, which we haven't also touched on, is a kind of near future told through eyewitness accounts, right? So scenarios from the ground up. So many of our scenarios are from the top down, right? From the UN perspective, from international organizations or leading policymakers. How does that change when you go from the ground up? Does it? Should it? What does it mean if we target our future planning to an individual citizen? The Biden administration argued that their foreign policy was for the middle class. That didn't work out at the ballot box, but actually the middle class is doing better in the US. And my international colleagues, when they come to the US, are surprised that we complain as much as we do about food or other costs. Relative to other countries, the US is doing great, right? So how do you communicate that? The Biden administration clearly didn't do a good job of that, thinking about the individuals within one country. Even harder when you try to transcend national boundaries. So that's one of the things that I try to think about. And then I'll sort of just try to loop it back together with a few other pieces of what we have and haven't talked about. When I try to define grand strategy, and a grand strategy that includes women's peace activists in the past, civil rights activists and others, and not just policymakers, I like to think about it as epistemology. I don't know if this will do any work for us here or not, but a way of structuring knowledge, and in particular, sort of doing grand strategy, doing future planning, trying to embed that in policymaking, trying to figure out how to do some simple messaging, but also hold the complex in your hands. It's fairly crucial to have a received wisdom about the past. And I think one challenge of the historical knowledge baked into epistemologies of grand strategy is that they're often quite different. This gets to, I think, the Cone and the different heritage projects and collective memory questions, which I think is what, at least in the US, we're foundering on the shoals of collective memory. That in the US, there are several dominant paradigms about collective memory and history, and they're competing. And the Trump administration's version is this very simple one. And this is our present moment. But if you go back through US history and the last 100 years or so, you find a number of triumphalist historical accounts that then don't give you the obligations for the future. They do not embrace a set of assumptions about what is incumbent on people living in the present to plan for in terms of grand strategy, whether it's nuclear war or climate change, or to fund in terms of heritage sites or culture and museums, right? That it's about a sort of ossified version of the past. And this gets to, I think, one connection between history and archaeology, the sort of fluidity here. So what Reynold Niebuhr called the flux of temporal events, that the way, at least in terms of when I talk to people in government about grand strategy, that we should try to develop a historical sensibility, what a practitioner, scholar Elliot Cohen called historical mind, a familiarity with the past, a feel for its rhythms and unpredictability. That's the Mark Twain is the rhymes part, the rhythms. And a comfort with the long view, being comfortable with the long view, a comfort with what David has said and what many historians reject, that we're looking to the long distant future, necessarily knowing that we may miss out. Look, I embedded a lot of little things there and nothing that profound. So I will leave it at that and we can get into our discussion. Thanks very much.
I disagree that there was much that was profound there, Chris. Much that was profound.
Yeah, excellent. So I think we had 4 great additions to the discussion of many new important fields. And we're a little behind, but not too late. And we still have an hour, but I think we should definitely take a short break now again. So maybe 6 or 7 minutes, okay? Or do you want to have the full 10 minutes as before? Maybe it's okay. So let's meet again here 20 to 5 Swedish time, or I think is it 20 to 12? Where are we now? Yeah, how about David? If we just give as many people as possible the microphone and collect some views. We're not that many. I think we can do that. Shall we do that? And then we see who's best placed to comment or reply to anything.
Yeah, I'm happy to open it up to questions, observations, comments, complaints.
Okay, let's do that. So you can just raise your hand in the normal way as we do that in Zoom, and then you get the mic, the screen, so to speak. Who would like to start? Here, I know. So, and all right, Paul, you're trying to.
You hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Just I was having trouble with the sound earlier on. If I could waffle on for a bit, I mean, on the one hand, there was this Danish politician in the late 30s who said that the one thing we can't predict is the future. But on the other hand, I'm quite keen on Braudel's idea of the longue durée, and I think there are kind of longue durée processes, and Noah's mentioned of demographics is a good case in point where, you know, in a sense that demographic change has been a constant driver in historical processes, whether it's, you know, colonialism, or I would certainly argue in the course of the First World War, for example. But what strikes me is that, I mean, the principal difference between the past and the future is that to the extent the past is knowable, we can't really change it, whereas to the extent that the future is knowable, we can at least attempt to change it. And most of what we've been talking about today is about thinking about how and whether we can actually change the future. So it's rather than kind of looking at it kind of fatalistically in terms of what is going to happen, it's a question of whether we as a small group of people, or more globally as a species, can actually do things to bring about a future. And in that context, as far as I can see, and particularly in the light of recent events in the United States, I mean, the situation is, if anything, becoming increasingly chaotic, and therefore increasingly difficult to actually do anything. I mean, you know, I keep thinking back to the Earth Summit of 1992, when they said that we had 25 years to solve the climate crisis, or it's too late. Well, we're well beyond 25 years. Now, I mean, all of that context, it seems to me that there are two different ways that you can go with this. One is to say, well, are there things that we can do to try to shape the future? And the other is to say, are there things we can do to mitigate what actually happens? And I think we're kind of rapidly getting towards the latter. And although I haven't really thought this through in any great detail so far, I mean, one of the things that archaeology, certainly in the cultural resource management area, has done a lot of is in the field of mitigation in terms of what are called mitigation strategies. And I mean, you know, at a basic level, that is, you know, with archaeological site, do you preserve it in situ? Do you preserve it by record? Or, as Caitlin De Silva and others have suggested, you know, do we in certain contexts go for what you might call a kind of managed decline? And I think there's a great deal to be said in, you know, thinking about whether realistically we need to be thinking more about mitigation rather than planning.
Maybe we Paul, thanks. Maybe we can get in a few more voices at this point, and then we'll see what we pick up. Who else would like to come in at this point? Those who haven't said anything yet. Sarah, how about you? Or Laila? We don't have your image, but I assume you're listening carefully. Sarah, there you go.
Yes, I'm listening. Yes, and now you have my image as well. Sorry, I've been at chat this weekend, and so my questioning is rather depleted, a more depleted aspect of these things. And I also think I really enjoyed listening to all of you speaking, and it was great to hear some people who I haven't heard before, as well as those of you who I have heard before. I was really struck by how well the different papers came together on thinking about things, that there was less divergence than it could have been expected. And I suppose at this point in these long discussions about how these things work, I wonder whether how much outside of it all we are. You know, we have an awful lot of a view that we can talk about how people should use heritage or should use heritage history, and how our own disciplines can contribute. And my feeling is that, you know, that business that we flagged before, where people say, "Oh yes, how interesting," and then they go on doing exactly what they've done all along. Right, and they use the word "the future" in their title, but they're doing, as you know, Andrew's example from the preservation of the monuments in war. You know, it's like they act as if they've taken on board something to do with the way that we've been discussing things, but actually they're really doing the exact same thing that they have always done. So I suppose this, as I say, I'm a little bit tired, as you may gather, but my element is like, what is there that we can do that would actually change the present, if we think that the present needs to be changed, if we think that our colleagues are doing things. And I suppose I do feel like this is the case. Like one of the last papers that I saw this weekend, forgive me for bringing in something that isn't in the room, but a person was talking about a project in the Philippines, where archaeological research had led to increased amounts of tourism, which were causing problems for the people in the area of the Philippines, the over-tourism problem. But that they were continuing to do the archaeology so that they could work with young people in the hopes that the young people would grow up and change their attitude towards what the valley's economy should be, and how it should use its heritage. And I felt like it's all very well to hope that that is the case, that we can say, oh, I'm just going to keep doing the thing that I've been doing and hope that it has some other kind of outcome, you know. So I suppose that would be my response. And what is it that you who've spoken think that could be done that would actually shake people from that tree? And of course, in a way, I know you don't have the answers, because you've been all the things you have been doing, you continue to do in the same way, you hope. But yeah, if there's something different, there you go.
Thanks. Before we address these issues, let's just hear more voices in the room. Leila, do you want to go on at this point?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Sorry that I closed the video. I was writing so many things. Yeah. Actually, I have many questions, but I would like to summarize them into one or two. One of them was from the archaeologist like you, Cornelius, and it's that when we study past and even present, like contemporary archaeology, we have many information databases, we have context, agency, human behavior, and also sometimes memory. But what about the future? So when it comes to the archaeology, when we are, speaking about the future, usually we think about heritage. So heritage is the materialistic thing, and we hope at least that it can be preserved for the future generations. But I was thinking about memory, because then there is no memory, about the future. And actually, somehow we are constructing. You showed us some AI images, and they were actually constructed based on the things that the AI has already. And it's a kind of construction somehow. What do you think about it? Is it a reconstruction or a construction?
Yeah.
When you think about the future?
Good.
Yeah. And the other thing is that Anders pointed to a very important thing, and it was colonialization of the future. So I'm from originally from a not a global North country, and then I know that we have very few sci-fi authors. There are very few directors who want to make a movie about the future. Most of the things that they are thinking about are those problems or shortcomings that people are encountering, in the present and in the contemporary society. So I think that it's one of the other things that even when we are thinking about the future, it's not that much diverse. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but I was wondering about that. Also, I was thinking that if this kind of decolonization happens, because we are somehow thinking in the framework of, nation states when we are speculating about the future. But we don't know if they, they continue to be like that in like 10 years. Maybe they change, maybe we will have a different form of states or countries, I don't know, nations. But as Anders mentioned, definitely there are many people who want to reconstruct or deconstruct or construct, I don't know, the future to endorse this identity and nation states. So these are my 2 points. Actually, I have many other questions. I'm sorry if they are like somehow messed up, because it was just a few minutes after the presentations. And thank you very much for these very wonderful ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, no, great, Leila. Interesting listening to you.
Yes.
And with this all in. But I think we'll just go around and hear from as many as possible. So I can get a sense that Emily is also ready to say something.
I've been answering email, sorry. Yeah, but my questions are far more US specific and have less to do with the future and more to do with trauma from last week. So
Hard not to, Emily.
no, but if you block this out, it comes back and it gets worse. Oh wait, that was 2016 to 2020. Just yeah, no. I suppose my questions or my kind of vague thoughts are along the lines of, academically, this is all well and good and valuable, and we should do more of this, especially across disciplinary lines, which tend to be old school and arbitrary. However, to what extent are we operating within what is a very privileged academic context with very thick ivory walls, and how can we have these conversations in such a way that actually makes an impact on, I'm going to call it the public, and how they understand how they themselves relate to history and they themselves can imagine the future. And for example, I spent an hour and a half talking to a Swedish journalist today she wanted to talk about what I thought the Roman Empire could teach us about the US right now. And I was like, this is not the question I'm interested in asking, and you shouldn't be either. And let's have a conversation about this. And by the end of it, she was like, wow, this is going to be great. I'm going to, write an article that's so different from everybody else's. And I'm like, good, I'm so glad. But the point being, we're always going to have this very simplistic analogy taking place, right? Because as we've learned and has been reinforced, talking about the past in the highly complex, subject-specific ways, nuance-specific ways we need to do as professionals does not translate to the public whatsoever, right? And there are always going to be people using these analogies very simplistically to try and make sense of the present and therefore future. That's not going away, ever. So given these things, how can we try and still, affect mass positive change, particularly in an environment like the US? And Christopher, I was very taken by what you said about how the US is floundering on, I think you said floundering on the shoals of multiple conflicting collected memories. I think that's a very articulate way of putting it. And I'm sorry that I did not pursue American history now as an undergrad and instead took one class and noped out of there. Because now that's where I've finally circled back to 20 years later. Oops. So I guess the overall point is, how can we balance our agenda, which is what we want to do as professionals and academics, to what I think the public arena needs? And I have no idea, so I'll just stop talking now.
Yeah, but a valuable point for sure, and connects back to what Chris was talking about earlier as well. But I think we'll just keep the screen open here. Roger, you've come to the screen in visual. Does that mean you are preparing to say a few words as well?
Well, I just saw everyone else showing their face. I've just flipped out of another meeting. I've been darting between the two, so I hadn't actually wanted to say much, but seeing I'm now speaking, I've very much enjoyed listening in today. And I suppose in my own experience, I've become very acutely aware recently, having left academia 4 or 5 years ago and working more in professional practice, how very much, our sense of the future, which we all grew up, well, certainly which I grew up with, and I think I could probably speak for others around this table, is very much broken. And the future we sort of grew up within, and which we always lived within, was very much about, progress and progress through innovation. And certainly when I was in academia, I found myself teaching, courses like innovation, production, consumption, looking at innovation in the past to explain change, but often lecturing against, following Pfaffenberger's work and others about how our ideas of progress and complexity are misplaced. And I think since I've left academia, I've become very much more acutely aware that the future is made in the past. It is located in the past. And that really emphasizes, to me at least, the responsibility of the sorts of narratives we generate in the past, because they produce the futures which we take with us in our day-to-day. There are, if you think of the fourfold analysis of agency, it's the traditions and memories which inform our way we go on the day-to-day. That's where we hold the idea of a future, and our addiction to linear time, our addiction to the idea of progress and innovation have very much got us where we are today with the climate predicament. And perhaps if we can, use that past to forge a future, which shows a different past and gives vision to a different future, which is the opposite really of innovation, the faith, the blind faith we've always placed in innovation. Perhaps there's, I don't think perhaps at all. I think there's a very, very strong role for heritage professionals, academics alike, to really animate that past in a way which shows a very different future, not one based on innovation, for want of a better word, something along the lines of ex-antiquation, I don't know, pulling stuff out of the old and bringing that old, sifting through the detritus we find ourselves in. I don't mean archaeological detritus, but the ruins of our climate, our planet, our civilization, of our relations with each other, and taking those forward into a future in a different way, which isn't based on progress. And I'm talking rubbish now, I'll back off, but it's really interesting stuff, and there's a lot to be said there, I think, on many levels. I'll shut up.
Very, very good point there, Roger, that different pasts may be able to give us different futures. And I'm thinking of the book that was very popular a few years ago, maybe still is, Wengrow and Graeber's The Dawn of Everything, which made exactly the point.
Yeah. I think if anything, we often think of it as something a little bit detached or a little bit esoteric. And, the more I've worked in professional practice, it's absolutely concrete. The future is made in how we write the past. I'll pass on, please.
Thanks. Now there's three more people who are here whose image we can see. Would you like to say anything, Ulrika, Rick, and Per? You don't have to. Don't feel like this. Yeah, Rick.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you all for first the presenters and then the commenters. My background is a bit different. So I left university, went into organizations, and discovered there how important the past is. And I completely agree with Roger that it is in the professional context that you see how important it is to see how futures are made in the past. And that's when I came back to university in 2002, I started the course Learning Histories, which is based on an American model developed in MIT, but we elaborated it a bit more. So I came from the other side, learning from history in order to orient organizations for the future. And it's there where I use especially David's his books and theories. So I was, as a historian, I was quite surprised how important the past is in organizations of all kinds. We have studied more than 100 of them. Then to the point which is very central, which was also addressed by Paul Grace Brown. Yes, we can know the past, but we cannot know the future. And there is an important point, because in the discussions, it was many times stressed that the past and the future, they are in a way similar. But if you look at it from a philosophical point of view, that's not entirely true. So David uses Anker Smith's representation theory, but here there is a big difference. In Anker Smith's theory, we can describe past states of affairs in descriptive sentences for which we claim truth value. But we cannot do the same for the future. We cannot claim truth for the future events. That's an important philosophical point, and that's exactly also the point why most of our colleague historians and archaeologists shy away from delving into the future. Now, I think we can solve a little bit of that by introducing the term of learning from history towards the future. And because learning is always future directed. So that's why my take on this. And how do we learn? And then I stop by discovering the blind spots we made in the past, the things we missed, the unknown unknowns of the past, to learn for a future, a more viable future. So, and now I have a question, because how does the notion of context, it's a very difficult notion. We use it all as historians, and it's one of those concepts we all use till people ask, what do you mean by it? And then we are a bit in embarrassment. What is context when we futurize? So these are my points.
Thank you. I put a little comment there in the chat. Ulrika, do you want to come in at this point?
I just want to say thank you very much for a very interesting conversation and brilliant presentation so far. I was kind of taken by Christopher's notion on how to turn it around from working with the future from a top-down perspective and changing that from the bottom up. And I think that Emily also touched upon that. So I would just want to push Emily's reflections forward and say that that's actually a quite interesting question for me as well, how to change that in policy planning, for instance, and making the public more maybe co-creating in the futures that they want, not that we want, and in terms of heritage. So yeah, that's probably my reflection to that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. So Natasha and Kevin, if you would like to add something, you can have the screen, but you don't have to. If not, who of us would like to come in first and respond to everything we've heard? Just open your microphone or raise your hand. Or David, do you want to say something?
No. Whoever's jumping in next, I'm happy to wait my turn.
I can do it. There are so many different things that have come up here, so it's impossible to grab them all in a minute here. So both Sarah and Emily were on the same topic and then we have a bottom-up perspective as well. And to me, that is a new research question. So we are so trained to inform people about what we know, but the things we have discussed here today are simply not always what we have done research on. So if we come out and are asked about how do futures literacy or future studies sort of relate to policy making in this specific context we are here in, we can give advice, of course, but sometimes we simply don't know. And one of the important things that I've learned from future studies is to ask, what do I need to know to understand what I don't understand to act in an informed way? To me, that is true future studies. To be able to ask that question and start to delve into it and elaborate on it. Because in the intersection between the academic knowledge and the practice, a whole new field of research opens up that we need to engage in asking new questions. That at least archaeology hasn't done that to a large extent. Someone has, but not to a large extent. We still teach our students that it is important to preserve heritage for the future, without engaging with the future, without engaging with the word preserve, and without engaging with the word important. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks. Who would like to? Yeah, Noah.
Just to come in quickly on two things. Looks like I'm going to freeze again. Maybe not. One, yeah, I'm probably overstating the future past. But I would maintain, Rick, that everything we think about a changing climate is based on truth claims with regard to the future. Second thing, okay, I'll just put it this way. I was struck, Anders, by your bringing up the Swedish Museum comment about cultural heritage being the flesh and blood of the nation. In relation to Emily's comment about the future of the nation state, I then have a lot of trouble squaring that with the Pact for the Future quote that Cornelius brought up. Our resilience, what was it exactly? Our renewal and progress grounded in our common humanity.
Exactly.
I can imagine futures where to ground in our common humanity, cultural heritage grounded in flesh and blood is removed.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think that was a very good observation. Maybe I can make a comment from my perspective. And I want to say something. I first thought about it when Chris was presenting and raised this issue of how to use heritage in a complex way. And I think that's just the point about heritage, that heritage is, although it is being studied by academics also, but the way it operates in society is not cognitively. It sits in the heart. It comes from people's stomachs, and that's what makes it so powerful. So it defines whom we feel, who we have allegiances with, whom we feel are the same like us, and who are very, very different from us. So I think if we want to make a difference, then it's not through education and sort of all the things we can learn, although that's an aspect of it too. And I'm not saying that's not needed, but it's not enough. And I think the power of heritage, that it is about what we deeply feel is right and wrong. It's about our values, it's about our identities. And for example, one of the biggest issues that is not talked about enough globally, and certainly not in the Pact for the Future, and not in the Agenda 2030, and that's the problem of trust in society that is often lacking, because many of the problems we see are lack of trust, both within societies and between societies, and that's 100% about heritage, because the past and heritage is supposed to show how some people you can trust and others you cannot. It defines divisions between different groups of people, and that's something which we affect by making people aware that you trust the people you know, like your neighbors. Often, the moment you get to know them, you're prepared to trust them because you've met them. They don't need to be like you in any way. They can have very different pasts, and still the meeting makes a difference. So that's the sort of way through which heritage can work. So if you manage to create a story about the past that defines commonalities and what you share with others, then that has an impact on your values and on your behavior, and which can, for example, help build more trust in society and between societies. So I think this is something that actually policy can impact. And I tried to get involved in a little bit of policy making and various levels, often related to World Heritage, for example, where this is missing. This idea that it's not about differences, but about commonalities. So I think there is a way in policy that is not cognitively, not about learning, but it is about feeling. And heritage is the way into that, or one possible way into that. Let's put it that way.
I didn't know if Chris wanted to jump in, make some observations.
I'm happy to. A few, yeah. I appreciate all the questions. I liked Rick's point about blind spots of the past, and that accords with how I've studied and thought about questions of grand strategy from policymakers. One of the major ways that policymakers use and misuse historical analogies is by finding blind spots and then making claims that having found that blind spot, they will avoid that problem moving forward, right? So this is David was talking about Kabul, but the classic one in the very recent past was the Bush administration's deliberations about the invasion of Iraq. And they used history a lot. We now have evidence, and they used it very poorly. literally. But they believed that they had found the blind spots there, that they could use, their sort of shock and awe campaigns. And I could go through, we could talk through the different dimensions, but their assumptions were, Rick points out, and this is the immediate historical past, their assumptions now are things we can interrogate. And there's several books that go through talking to these folks and seeing what they got wrong in their own finding of historical analogies that would inform future policymaking. So that's it's right and it's wrong. And then you get to this question that lots of scholars have talked about in terms of how do you do this better? And that's where I think we land on planning and the importance of the scenarios and proposals. For me, one thing that the study of this shows at the higher policy levels, at the level of nonprofit organizations, people running businesses and in thinking about innovation and higher education, is that we need to do this planning in advance. Or to paraphrase Dwight Eisenhower, it is not about the planning. It's not about the plans themselves. It's about the planning. The act of planning allows you to anticipate many possible futures, many different scenarios, right? And even though none of those may come to be, having done that planning makes you more nimble for the next step, right? I mean, I think I believe that in my heart. I believe that as a scholar. One of the challenges, though, is as Cornelius was just noting, one of the challenges of say, heritage or these collective memory problems that Emily was saying, what I said was that the U.S. is foundering on the shoals as if it's a ship of multiple conflicting collective memories. The heritage, as you were noting, Cornelius, heritage can define difference. Heritage can be competitive. Heritage can be brutal, right? So finding those points of commonality within that sort of system, the different scenarios that might allow you to move more in that direction. Particularly, I think at the nation state level, one of the things that I've advocated for in the US, we don't tend to do, but the National Security Council and other organizations have the capacity to do planning to anticipate and have stockpiles and have allocate resources for different sorts of scenarios. And one of my favorite examples, side note, I was a scholar of the 1918-19 pandemic and did 1 million interviews in the last few years, as you might imagine. One of the lessons that the US should have learned, and many folks around the world should have learned coming out of 1918 and 19, was that there needed to be international governance around shared responsibilities for pandemics. Several countries started their own national public health organizations. The US did not. And the US didn't join the League of Nations. The League of Nations had a very nationalist set of challenges related to how they would do planning for malaria and other kinds of international diseases. I could go on a long tangent here, but the long story is that nationalism trumped collective public planning and pandemic planning and public health planning throughout the 20th century in my reading of that history. But and here's where we can have a little hope as scholars. When George Bush, for instance, read the draft of John Barry's book on the Great Flu, he started in the National Security Council a pandemic planning organization that actually led to the stockpiles that moved the U.S. in a positive direction. The Trump administration botched the pandemic, but there was the capacity there. In fact, if you talk to public health scholars around the world in 2019, they would have said the U.S. was the best prepared because it had done this planning. So one, a scholar helped, two, a foresight from one president, a major administration assisted, but then they still botched it. So back to Rick's point, what are the blind spots there? I mean, obviously there's Trump, but what else could have been done collectively, right? Why weren't intellectual property rights subsumed under global need, right? I think the pandemic and other crises help us to cast in sharp relief some of the questions of heritage, of history, and then how you can anticipate future challenges to do better in the present. And back finally around to Ulrika, I really think that if we could think about how we could co-create, and I like that phrase, at the grassroots level, we could do more of this more effectively. But what does that mean? I think one small example that I have is how a lot of museums today are now thinking about those who come in, not as passive receivers of knowledge, but as active learners, deeply engaged in understanding artifacts, holding them, even creating history, listening, or looking at the different archaeological things, total immersion in the archaeological space. There are even places where they allow you to, do some of the practice of that, right? Whether it's a child or an adult, it doesn't matter. And so the co-creating the present for a better future, again, it sounds like jargon or marketing speak, but I think there's something there that actually could be very useful in figuring out how to bridge that complex and nuance and the more simple. That's probably 5 or 6 thoughts, but anyway, thanks.
Super. Just super.
Great. Yeah. I saw Gustav, you were nodding a lot.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think I like that we came into the topic of co-creativity actually that Ulrika mentioned and that Chris was also picking up on. It's I also think that there's a lot more to do in terms of co-creating futures. But I like Emily also mentioned this the ivory tower, right? Academic ivory tower, and also indigenous futures have also been mentioned here today. And I do I see the I mean I've also experienced this major problem that there might be a complete lack of maybe communication understanding between the academic world and actually the profession and the needs within the profession and how to kind of reach some kind of synergy effects here. I from my experience, maybe it would be, I mean, maybe we need more kind of projects or initiatives that are focused on actually like collaboration or partnerships, like with also outside of the academic world, and maybe less that like universities are studying. I mean, I work with museums, for example, but or other types of heritage organizations, but that universities are studying how museums are working or studying how this organization is working. And maybe, of course, I think that those kind of research projects are also very, very much needed. Of course, we also need those research projects, but maybe also need more of the projects where it's actually more of a partnership or a collaboration where we work together for something that we all of us are identifying as necessary to work with, for example, futures literacy, and that we actually, so that the projects are becoming that there would be a less hierarchical the initial starting point in this way, so that it doesn't become the academic telling everyone else how they should do things in some ways. So working more in these kind of ways with partnerships. Sometimes it can be, of course, conflicts of interest, and there can also be more difficult maybe to get funding for these kind of initiatives. Sometimes there are very strict regulations that the involved partners need to have have a PhD and in order to get funding. So there are like structures in place that can maybe hinder the process of actually working in more forms of in a more collaborative way. But I think it can be very rewarding and also to kind of dismantle some of this kind of academic ivory tower. And another point that was mentioned, the co-creativity aspect. I think that there's likely much more that needs to be done in order to actually have this kind of co-creative way of engaging with futures literacy, maybe working from the bottom up in a co-creative way rather from the top down. In some ways, I think the project that I mentioned briefly towards the end of what I was talking about, the project in Växjö Araby, where we were interviewing young people about their ways of investing a place with hope for the future, is a way of kind of attempting to move in that direction, at least by listening to young people and actually not. And actually asking us what we can actually learn from how young people are engaging with the future in their own ways, and what kind of heritage that are kind of being created in that process. But it's a very kind of small scale project, and I think much more would be needed in that way. And it's more in that way also more of listening and taking in perspectives, and not maybe actually actively working in a co-creative way with these young people. That would be kind of the next step, to kind of take in the kind of co-creative approach to it, and co-creating futures bottom up, maybe with different target groups or audiences. But yeah, very interesting points, and I think there's a lot more that needs to be done overall. Yeah.
Yeah, David, do you want to come in at this point?
Thank you. Yes, and boy, I have lots of points I'd like to address. Let me start. I had mentioned when I think it was Anders put up the futures cone, that I said I've been in particular lately exploring the realm even beyond the possible that Joseph Voros calls the preposterous futures. And in fact, it's started to influence a lot of my writing about the future lately. So I've been reading a lot of Stanislaw Lem, the sci-fi writer, and in the 70s, especially 70s and the 80s, his style really started to change to what I would call a kind of hallucinogenic, trippy, sort of hippie futures. If you read these books, I mean, they really are sort of wild and almost comical in some ways. And I was reading one of his short stories from the 70s, and he's, again, imagining this wild future where there's a computer such that you'll be able to ask it to write a poem, and it would produce a poem for you. And I said, my God, he already was thinking about large language models before anybody else was. And that's why it's important to think in terms of preposterous futures, both in challenging assumptions. Cornelius, I think you drew attention to assumptions. Preposterous futures really do force you to consider load-bearing assumptions in our thinking. And I guess at the same time, identify or deal with blind spots. And so, as I say, I've been writing more preposterous futures as of late. I'm writing one right now having to do with the election, so that'll be published next week, I hope. Our conversations come around this idea of co-creating futures, and I think this is really, really important, really crucial. I forget who made reference to colonizing the future, which I think is really important. One of the questions that I always wrestle with my students, both in history and design, I teach occasionally in design, is who gets to imagine and who gets to create the future. You know, we're having this conversation here about futures, and we as academics can think about the future. Corporations very frequently get to imagine what the future is going to look like because presumably they think they're going to make it. I share with my students a series of advertisements from the early 1990s from AT&T, and you can watch these on YouTube. They're wonderful. So again, this would have been the early 90s, and they're saying things like, imagine you could be on the beach and you can take a meeting. It was essentially sort of a early sort of Zoom. And they go through all these sort of futuristic inventions, and who's going to bring it to you? AT&T. Will you be able to do this? Will you be able to do this? And they conclude by saying, "You will." And I tell my students, you can read that one of two, or you can listen to that one of two ways. You will as a prediction. In the future, you'll be able to do a meeting, from the beach or whatever, or you could read it as a command. You will. Because AT&T said so. And it's, of course, funny because AT&T doesn't, in fact, develop most of these technologies. But in many ways, I think it's corporations that and technologists in particular that think they get to define the future. When I am working with students, with young people on the future, they confess to me that they actually are indifferent about the future. They don't care about it. And what that means is they don't feel as if they have any control or agency. They look in particular at climate change, and they say, yeah, I can, I don't use plastic straws, and I ride my bike instead of riding a car. But at the end of the day, I don't feel like anything I can do can change the fact that the planet's going to incinerate. And so one of the things we do is we introduce techniques like idealized design or backward casting, where they get to make the future they want. And to sort of show I don't know if anyone has ever used backcasting before, but you create the future you want, and then you work back from that. All right, what has to happen for this future that we want to come into place? Someone mentioned Ministry for the Future before. Ministry for the Future, in some ways, is a kind of idealized future. And once you introduce that idea to students, they're like, oh, wow, maybe there's something I can do here. Maybe there's some actions that I can take today, which signals, I suppose, sort of two things. First of all, that futuring is as much about the present as it is the future. That futures work is as much about choices and actions and decisions we make today. I put a link to a book by the designer Tony Fry on design futures. He defines futuring as creating the conditions so that there is a future. Things that we can do today to ensure that we have a future. He's pretty dour on the future of the planet. The other point to be made about this is that futures or images of the future or proposals of the future is political. It's political if politics is defined as the negotiation of divergent interests. And I wonder the degree to which our politics are as much a politics of the future as anything else. And I guess the last thing I'll sort of say in that connection is, and we began this, actually, Cornelius, you began this with your initial talk, is thinking about long-term futures. How far is long-term? How far is too long? When I consult, I still engage in some foresight consulting with organizations. When they say future, when most at least American companies say future, they are thinking in terms of 18 months to 2 years. That's a long time. Wow, boy, we're going to do some really outside the box thinking. We're going to think 2 years from now. I worked with an organization once, and they were looking ahead. So it was an insurance association of insurance companies, and they were looking out 20 years, which at least among the American companies I've worked with is about as long as I think any organization is thinking about. We know that European firms, certainly Japanese firms, Chinese firms too, are very much accustomed to thinking out in terms of 50 to 100 years. I've been doing some consulting with a global company. I won't say where, won't say who. There's NDAs there. But they are right now, they're looking at 2050. They're thinking out to 2050. And among companies, I think that's really a long time. So this is about 10 years ago, though I think it still holds. I was at a conference of mostly people from the defense and homeland security sector. And so as I say, this is about 10 years ago. Maybe it's about 2010, I guess it was. Maybe 2010. And he gets up and he says, all right, we're going to talk about scenarios in the year 2100. And people laughed at him. And he let the laughter die down for a bit. And he says, you realize there are people walking the earth today who will be alive in the year 2100. There are people alive right now who are going to be there in 2100. So we're talking about within people's lifetime right now, the future of people's lifetimes. And that actually quieted the laughter down quite a bit. All of that's by way of saying, I'm very curious, I'm very interested to think more about how long can we think in the future? Cornelius, I think you mentioned nuclear semiotics, which is thinking really like 10,000 years or so. And Noah just put Long Now Foundation, right? Our date is 02024 right now. But I think it is something important to consider when we're thinking about futures work. How far are we allowing our imaginations to soar into the future? How deep into the future are we allowed to do that? Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, David. Very good. And of course, as archaeologists, we are always thinking far into the future. And in the nuclear context, it's not seldom, and even there's policy on 100,000 years in the future. The US has 10,000 years, but that's shorter than most countries. So it's this is intriguing. But we've reached the end of the time, and I just want to have one observation at the end, sort of looking at this seminar, because I think we are also co-creating something else here from the bottom up, because this is also the learning environment of the future. This is a more or less spontaneous gathering of people from different countries and different time zones, different realities, different professions and disciplines and so on, although many of us are archaeologists or historians. But I think there's a potential in this format. I've certainly taken a lot from this, lots of new ideas and angles that I haven't have not yet fully thought through, but will follow up over the coming weeks. So I think this is also a way of future making in the present through just something we do and prefigure the future in that sense, by the way of how we act and how we engage with each other and how we are curious about each other and listen to each other. So maybe that is a good final comment from me. Is there anything else anybody would like to point out at the end? Or David, would you also like to have a final words?
Only to thank everyone for their participation and their good questions and their good company.
Exactly. And of course, I also think that. So I think it was a small group, but a really good group and great discussion. And let's meet again in some context like this or in some other format. At some point in the future, maybe not in 10,000 years from now, but sooner than that. Okay, so thank you all very much for coming and see you soon.